So welcome to this evening's People, Place and Community seminar, in which Sibia Akhtar is going to talk to us about global threads co-producing histories of international networks. Sibia completed her Masters in History in September 2020, funded by a scholarship from the Aziz Foundation. She focused on issues of race and racism in modern Britain and ways to make this history more accessible using public history approaches. Her research with the Global Threads Public History Project focuses on retelling the history of Irk Mill, as well as the significance of South Asian textiles in shaping leisure activities and political resistance. These stories are often hidden, so her work here is to uncover the rich histories in hope that people will learn more about these local stories and their global connections. Sibia currently works as an associate curator for the Science and Industry Museum. So over to you, Sibia.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I'm just going to get started, if that's okay. So as Rita said, my name's Sibia, and I'll be talking to you today about the Global Threads Public History Project. So this was a project in collaboration with the Legacies of British Slave Ownership at UCL and the Science Industry Museum in Manchester. This project sought to explore Manchester's cotton industry and shed light on telling new inclusive stories in an accessible way. I researched two case studies as part of the Global Threads, one being the history of Elk Mill, which is an Oldham textiles mill with global connections, the other exploring the significance of Kali textiles in shaping India's movement for independence from British colonial rule. Understanding how local industrial heritage narratives have global connections that we don't always appreciate was really important in how I framed my case study on Elk Mill. In my research, I used what we would consider to be a traditional set of industrial heritage sources to reveal a global story about Lancashire's textile industry. My research explored the decline of Lancashire's traditional textiles industry and expansion of industrial textiles manufacturing in India through the lens of Oldham's last mule spinning mill, Elk Mill, and Platt Brothers, who were Oldham's machine manufacturers who supplied textile machinery to mills in Lancashire as well as across the world. The Science Industries Museum's collection of historic working textile machinery includes several machines and other industrial heritage objects which were once used at Elk Mill. The presence of these objects in the museum's collection inspired me to research the mill and explore more about its local and global connections. I was keen to use my research to make Oldham's industrial heritage relevant to young people living in Oldham today. As an Oldhamer myself, I'm aware that many younger local people are not familiar with textiles heritage of the Elk Mill shopping park, where the mill once stood, and they do not engage with industrial heritage of their hometown. This could be because traditional industrial stories do not tell the stories which are relevant to them, particularly for minoritized communities who often do not have the autonomy to tell their own stories and experiences. I want to shed light on this history and reveal both our local and global stories that would be relevant to Oldham's diverse community. On a visit to Elk Mill Shopping Park today, a collection of public artworks is the only trace of the huge cotton mill that once stood on this site until its demolition in 1999. The presence is a reminder of a period that witnessed a global reorganization of the global cotton economy, with Lancashire experiencing a radical decline from its world-leading position as textiles industry elsewhere, including South Asia, drew dramatically. Elk Mill in Oldham was the last mule spinning cotton mill to be constructed in Lancashire when it was completed in 1927. When it closed 71 years later, the region's traditional textile manufacturing industry had almost completely disappeared, with great consequences for former cotton towns like Oldham, their economies and their communities, as well as people across the world. Elk Mill was built by textile manufacturing company Shiloh Spinners. Founded in 1874, Shiloh owned a number of factories across Oldham and its surrounding area. They manufactured yarn, which was spun into cloth in mills across Lancashire. Much of this was then exported to mills across the world. Many were surprised at Shiloh Spinners' decision to invest in a brand new mill at such a difficult time for the industry. In the 1920s, Lancashire's cotton industry was experiencing a serious depression. Exports had suffered during the First World War and never returned to pre-war levels, thanks to rising competition from nations like India, Japan, and the US, where investment in new machinery and lower labour costs enabled production of cotton at cheaper prices than Lancashire. Oldham was not only a global centre for cotton spinning, it was also one of the largest producers of cotton manufacturing machinery. Founded in 1821, Oldham-based Platt Brothers, who were machine manufacturers, supplied mills across Lancashire, including Elk, with the machinery used at all stages of the textile making process, from cleaning raw cotton to combing the fibres, spinning fibres into yarn, to then weaving into cloth. By the 1900s, they were the largest textile machinery makers in the world, employing 15,000 people. Machinery from the Elk Mill held in Science Industry Museum collection was actually manufactured by the Platt Brothers. As well as supplying Lancashire's mills, Platt Brothers had also exported machinery across the world, including to growing nations like the US, China, Japan, Russia, South America, and South Asia. Platt Brothers' overseas exports expanded dramatically in the 20th century, whilst orders from the home market had declined. From the 1850s, India's mechanized cotton industry began to expand, growing rapidly during and after the First World War. The first modern industrial mills were built in Bombay, now Mumbai, by the Bombay Spinning and Weaving Company. They were fitted with Platt Brothers machinery made in Oldham. Thousands of workers flocked from rural areas in search of work as Indian entrepreneurs invested in the industry. In the Science Industry Museum archive, I found examples of Platt Brothers' trade literature, which includes photographs of Indian mills and the machinery supplying, enabling me to draw out a global thread between Oldham and South Asia. When researching the history of Elk Mill, I also explored Oldham archives, which holds a great deal of resources of the history of the mill and Platt Brothers. Using this archive, I was able to build up a picture of how Shiloh spinners ran the mill and what it was like to work there. Documents including Christmas cards for mill workers from the management suggested Shiloh spinners were very much involved in their workers' personal lives, and there was mutual respect between both workers and owners. I also found that Elk Mill had a children's nursery and provided laundry facilities. Employees received a share of profits each year, and there were bonuses for long service. Labour shortages were a constant problem for Lancashire's mill owners during the unstable and shifting period for the global textiles industry. So these benefits are perhaps unsurprising and were likely designed to help attract and maintain loyalty in their employees. I also incorporated some oral history as part of my research in order to reveal more about the lived experiences of those who worked at Elk Mill. The Voice of Shiloh by Fredo Miller features the testimony of many former workers and covers the impact that the closure of the Elk Mill had as a result of the decline of Lancashire's textile industry. Although this does capture many voices, it primarily focuses on platforms, workers of English descent, and the experiences of Elk Mill. Oldham had many mill workers of South Asian descent who had contributed to the cotton industry, but it was difficult to find their voices in the oral history collections. Future projects like Global Threads could have further reach and impact if they'd included an oral history dimension which captured the lived experiences of communities, particularly people from racially minoritized communities who have direct experience of or who have been impacted by the legacies of the narratives that are being explored. In future, I'd like to see similar projects to Global Threads extend their reach by working with community groups or schools and colleges, involving them in conversations about this research. As well as these resources, I also visited the Elk Mill site and captured speed frame bobbin sculptures commemorating the history of the site. These bobbins include poems written in Bengali and Urdu. In this way, unlike oral history collections, this artwork does recognise the contributions made by South Asian workers who worked at Elk Mill and the mill's global connections. When thinking about the future of museums and public history research, it would be beneficial to have more paid opportunities like Global Threads project for master's graduates to be involved in. I learned a lot about Oldham, and I've always wondered about the history of Elk Mill, and I hope my research enables more people to appreciate not only how Oldham contributed to Lancashire's cotton industry, but also how it's a part of a wider global history of textiles. In addition to my research here, we organised some workshops for June 2022 to engage visitors of the Science Industry Museum with our research. When planning workshops, I learned a lot about engagement with different audiences, particularly with early years and primary school children who had often visited on school trips. Therefore, I planned my workshops accordingly, by focusing on sensory items and handling objects for younger children, which sparked their interest in cotton and textiles, as well as thinking about relating this back to young people. For example, having the children share thoughts on their clothing that they wear today. This has been a great learning experience for myself. These skills will be very important for visitor engagement and shows how to make these activities more inclusive as well as appealing. My work on this project also helped to think critically about development of my own career. I've always been interested in research and working collaboratively, and my work on the Global Affairs project enabled me to gain valuable experience, such as working on archival documents and centering the voices of those who are not often heard. These skills are extremely relevant to my new role currently as an associate curator in the Science and Industry Museum. So I just want to share how grateful I am to have worked on this project with both Science and Industry Museum and the Legacies of British Slave Ownership. I would also like to take the opportunity to spotlight my case study on the Khadi textiles, which can be accessed on the Global Affairs website. I'll share the link later on. So I thought I'd have a read of this case study, if that's okay. When Gandhi arrived in Darwin to adulation and cheers in late September 1931, at the height of the economic crisis, his simple clothing was the source of much comment and interest among the crowds of working-class Lancastrians. His wearing khadi, traditionally handspun and woven textiles of a type of crafted in South Asia for centuries. Industrially produced cotton was one of the driving forces behind British colonialism. Therefore, homespun cotton was taken up by the anti-imperial movement as a powerful symbol of resistance to economic domination, with Gandhi describing it as an appeal to go back to our former calling. Prior to colonization, India had been the global leader in cotton textile manufacturing, but British authorities had followed policies which suppressed industrial development and production, creating a vital market for cloth exports and jobs for Lancashire workers. When British made textiles dominated the mass market in India, centuries-old domestic craft traditions continued in rural areas as a way of providing homemade clothing, generally generating income as a leisure activity. Products range from simple plain cloth to colourful or intricate patterns with many regional differences, which communicated a variety of social messages ranging from community identification to political deference. So that was just a little snippet from my second case study on Khadi and Gandhi's visit to Lancashire. But I guess I just wanted to sort of end on that note, which is this project has shown not only to research my local history, but also explore further research into how Khadi as a cloth became a form of political resistance. And I will end my talk there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sibia. This sounds like it was such an amazing project, which clearly has been really wonderful for you. So I'm sure that there are lots of things that we might want to discuss, sort of provoked by those kind of thoughts that you've shared with us. I just wondered if you could say, just really briefly, a little bit more about, the bigger project that you were part of and the various different things that Global Threads project was doing, and kind of how what you've shared with us kind of fitted in with the bigger thing that was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So I spotlighted two of my research studies, but there was a team of about 7 people that worked on a variety of research. So someone researched Frederick Douglass, and someone researched just sort of looking at cotton cloth from different parts of Manchester. And I also, so when I talked about Gandhi, I also explored Lancashire's history with cotton. So it was more of is exploring both local and global connections. So that was in the form of researching case studies. But afterwards, we did try and take this research to the museum and displaying our research, as well as focusing on handling objects to connect with local visitors. And as well as sort of engaging in local activities. So we had visitors sort of check their clothing, seeing where cloths were made, and then making a little map about where where they were made to like where they've come from, which is like to Manchester. So making that seeing that spatial link, and that's quite important for us to explore. And it was a great yeah, we had a great turnout, and visitors loved it as well.
Great, thank you so much, Sibia. It's great to know the kind of context for this. Please, people do put kind of questions in the chat or raise your hand if you've got anything. But Sibia, I just wondered, oh, Catherine's kind of jumped in with a question. Catherine.
I did mean to interrupt you. Yeah, so just keen to ask a question, Sibia. It's great that we're going to have lots of space for discussion. So I think it's a wonderful project. I just wanted to say, doing such important work, telling these stories that haven't received the attention and representation that they might have done in the past. A wonderful project, congratulations. I wanted to ask you a little bit, I was really fascinated about the picture that you painted of the site of Elk Mill in Oldham today, where the mill itself is invisible, it's gone, it's been demolished, but you talked about the public artworks on the site, and you talked about going to photograph them, and this is something that I'm very interested in, the way that we can use public art to engage communities, to tell perhaps hidden or less well represented stories, and particularly to kind of show something of reveal things that are absent perhaps in landscapes today that were once present. So I think you mentioned that they're cotton bobbins or cotton reels, is that right? And you mentioned that they have inscriptions with poems in Urdu. You mentioned another language
Bengali,
as well. Bengali, yeah, fantastic. I wondered, sort of two-part question really, if you could tell us a little bit more, if there's anything more to say about those artworks, and then I would really welcome your reflections on where you see the potential of art and perhaps co-created art or public art as a tool for telling these stories or engaging communities. I was really struck by the way you articulated your ambitions maybe to do further work with community groups and schools. What's your sense of what art can do that maybe other approaches can't?
Brilliant question. Thank you so much, Catherine. So these bobbins that are in Elk Mill right now, they have inscriptions in different languages. I did take a picture of them. I didn't find it, but it's the fact that they're written in different languages. Like each line, each stanza was written in a different language, and it was the whole idea. Like it commemorates the workers that work there, but also there's no translation either. So I was checking. I can't read Bangla either, so I was thinking. I have no idea what they're saying, which is quite unfortunate because I thought, you know, it's definitely telling us something, but it'd be brilliant if there was a translation provided as well. But I think artwork is amazing. It's a very like you can't miss it kind of thing. Like if it's there in the public's eye to see it, it's invites questions and engagement, and I think that's a powerful thing about art. I think what would have been more valuable if there was maybe like a translation or something there with the artwork so then we can access that knowledge. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. I have to I can't help connecting with something in my own experience, which was a public artwork where we used some medieval Latin on it, and we actually also took the decision not to include a translation on site, although something was available elsewhere. It's a very, as you say, quite a deliberate and quite a surprising decision in a way to include a language without a translation, but obviously very, very deliberately done, and perhaps says something very interesting in the way that kind of different communities will gather in different ways, and different language communities will kind of make different sense out of those artworks. So I think that's really fascinating. Yeah, thank you so much for your answer, Sibia.
Thank you, Catherine. Sibia, there's so much that we could talk about, but I know that we've had a kind of a conversation before about how this project then sort of has led to what you're doing now and the role that you have now in the Science and Industry Museum, and your kind of, you know, what you've been saying about thinking about how you engage with communities, particularly the kind of local communities that you yourself are part of. And yeah, I just wondered if you could say a little bit about what your role in the Science and Industry Museum currently is, and kind of reflecting on how you are negotiating some of those difficulties of engaging with local communities, minoritized communities who might not feel like these museums are kind of comfortable spaces or welcoming spaces for them.
Yes, absolutely. So currently I'm an associate curator and I work on the Power Hall Gallery, which looks at engines and trains, locomotives, sort of bringing out the story. So it's currently under redevelopment at the moment. So and it's due to open spring 2025. So I'm sort of exploring sort of ways of retelling new stories with the same objects essentially. And the good feature about this new gallery is I will be introducing people stories, so both historic and contemporary people stories. So my work has been to like take some oral history testimonies of those who are working in these current fields, explain like why they entered this workplace and what they enjoy about this work, and try to sort of engage again with like visitors about this sort of like I guess learning about what these people do at work right now. Um, and I think one of my big standpoints is just sort of exploring a new narrative about work and engaging with people about what work really is about. And it's not just a 9 to 5, it's more about getting out in the workplace and meeting new people, and that's so exploring that in the museum as well. So that's very key for the Power Hall Gallery. So yeah, bringing new stories and voices and sharing them with visitors, and so that they can connect with objects through storytelling.
Our colleague at the IHR here, Claire Langhammer, is currently working on a project all about work and histories of work in the 20th century. She would be so interested to connect with this research. Sibia, we'll have to point her in your direction. Can I chip in with another sort of a question relating to this? So I was going to ask about oral history. Really interesting to hear that you're drawing in oral history in these ways. But I was also really struck by a detail you gave of you were talking about your ambition of engaging young people with this research, in the sense that perhaps for young people today in Oldham, these buildings aren't visible anymore. This is now the demolition of the mill was sort of late 90s, right? So,
Yes.
a generation ago, and you're looking at ways of making that connection with the younger generation. You said something about starting with the clothes that young people are wearing. And I think, that kind of materiality and the intimacy of obviously, our clothes, that we inhabit in our bodies is a really, I think that's a wonderful kind of way in to grab people's imagination. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that starting point and where you might take that in terms of your work with young people that you're sort of imagining for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we did the workshops with young people and colleagues from the Global Feds project, we had visitors sort of see the label on their clothes, and then some were saying that made in India, made in Bangladesh, and it's just the whole idea of what does it mean, like made in where, like, and then we talked about like sort of sweatshops and how those exist, and sort of humanizing that story from our clothes, and that was quite yeah, we had a lot of interesting insights from visitors, and I think that's a great way of sort of engaging that story, because it's just something we just don't move past. Like we don't really investigate the labels of our clothes, do we? And yeah, I mean, normally just sort of brush it off. So I guess that was really a great way of sort of learning that history. And I think in the future, so we have been working with like certain like community groups local to Manchester about not just Global Feds, but I guess with the Power Hall Gallery too, and having them. So for example, I worked on an event for South Asian Heritage Month, and a bit of the local community group in Manchester about sort of engaging with that story. So another way of sort of teaching people about trains is sort of thinking about travel. Where do we like going on holiday? And then we explored those stories and with this group in Manchester, and we spoke about why do we like what do we like where do we like going on trains or plane or any forms of travel. And then we had them sort of make postcards afterwards, and then it's just a great way of sort of learning stories about how do trains work and why do we go in trains and just talk about the environment. It's loads of layers to it. And yes, I do think that hosting workshops is an incredible way of engaging with local communities, those who may not necessarily visit the museum, but sort of bringing that story out to them, and then forming those relationships, and then sort of building on them, and then hopefully that they will visit the museum later on and with their families and friends and showing them like, this is what I saw last time I went to the museum. This is what I quite like about the museum. It's again connecting and building those relationships, and I'm very passionate about that.
That's fantastic. And you're kind of creating ambassadors for the museum, a kind of network of ambassadors for what you do. And I think what you're saying is so compelling, those starting points, what we wear, where we travel, our own kind of geographies and geographical networks, and how they connect us with these stories. And obviously being in Oldham, and as you're saying, you're working with a lot of communities that will also, it's not just about tourism travel, they will have their own strong family connections with that region. And so it's, connecting with kind of heritage and with a part of the world where there are already strong connections, which is obviously such a powerful thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Sibia, is your background in kind of interested in industrial histories, or was this quite a new thing for you that you had to kind of engage with?
I do think sort of working on Global First project, it helped me sort of gain interest in industrial heritage, and I'm very passionate about. It's not just, again, what I said before, like about traditional industrial heritage stories. It's more about I like connecting with people, working with people, learning about people and how they worked in the sector, and bringing those stories to life. That's what I'm passionate about.
I think that's so interesting, and I think that the way that you've demonstrated with that Global Threads project, this way in which you can take quite traditional kind of industrial heritage narratives and to, well, do that kind of social history through the industrial heritage, but to also diversify that and to think about networks of, places that often have been talked about in quite a sort of localized way, so that there are these kind of factories that had a local community who were sort of moving through them. And there are some interesting things that you were saying about the relationships between the factory owners and the workers, which we might want to kind of return to in a little bit later, but also thinking about these bigger international networks. That I was thinking that some of the industrial kind of history sections of the Victoria County history could maybe learn a little bit from that to pull in some of these stories that are not just local stories, but they're ways in which these, very not necessarily small places, but sometimes quite small places were actually connected in really interesting ways to different places. And so in terms of like tracing those networks, what was your kind of method to be able to find these links between the local industrial site and then the bigger global network that they were part of?
For me, it's actually a different one. So when I first started working on this project, I was sort of fresh out of uni, and I was a master's graduate. And I did tell sort of the people that worked on they're leading this project, so Katie Belshaw and Matt Sallard. So I sort of came with them with an idea, said, oh, I want to work on Elk Mill. It's a mill that was in Oldham, but I don't know much about it. And they sort of directed me to these sort of concepts, and they told me a bit more about how to research. And that's where I learned a bit more about sort of the who worked on these factories, and sort of exploring that link and connection, like exploring the link and global connections with that. So it's more about it's more about like how I was advised and to explore this sort of research. And I think the really good thing about the Global First project is like it was like paid work, and that was something that's quite hard to get into like straight after uni. Like a lot of the times it's like a lot of volunteering you've got to do, but it's just nice to have been paid for this work that we're doing. A lot of research that went into it, a lot of time and like work goes into it. So yeah, I think in the future it'd be great to have like more paid opportunities for like those who come out of uni and they're putting in the work to like research.
Yes, indeed. I think that's a very astute reflection. Christiane has put a question in the chat which says, did I understand correctly that Oldham made machinery that was exported? Could you say a bit more about the machinery and where it went? Do they still exist, and are there stories about these machines?
Yeah, so when I was exploring the machines that were exported, that were made in Elk Mill, so it was made by the Platt brothers, who I don't think they don't currently exist anymore, but they were exported to areas like Japan and India, and as well as the US. So it was made at Elk Mill, and then they were exported outwards, and um, it was exploring that global link. And So the stories with the machines, I'm not too sure about sort of the individual stories about these machines, but it's something that I would love to explore.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what still exists, maybe even what's still being used, because there are lots of stories, aren't there, about things that have moved around and are still in use or in a museum somewhere else. I thought it was very interesting in terms of what you were saying about what has survived from these locations. So Catherine was saying about, the mill itself is no longer kind of visible within the landscape, but that there was obviously a kind of feeling that something about that regional industrial history was worth maintaining, and therefore the collection process of the industrial machinery had happened. And so when you were talking about the oral histories that you were working with, these were oral histories that had been undertaken before, sort of while the factories were closing down, is that right?
Yeah, so I think it was after the factory had closed, and then sort of some testimonies were sort of published afterwards, and that's what I used to sort of support my research.
But you said that the voices of kind of marginalized communities were quite often missing from within
Yeah,
those oral histories. Yeah.
yeah, from that published text, I couldn't find any of those who were sort of racially minoritized communities. But when I went to the Elk Mill site itself, it's told me a different story about it through the public artwork. So I just found that quite fascinating.
Very interesting to think about why that might have been
Mm.
on kind of both sides. There are going to have been reasons, aren't there? Catherine.
This is so fascinating, Sibia, and I think we're all learning a lot from the kind of methodologies that you're describing. I was very struck by a phrase you used near the beginning of your presentation, where you described your work as looking at a traditional set of industrial heritage sources, but revealing this radically different story, this international story. Now, one of the things I love that you're doing this evening, and this came out as you were discussing this with Ruth just now, is it's so clear that this is not just a kind of industrial history project. This is about human stories. It's social history. It's oral history. But speaking as someone who doesn't work in this particular area, I'm really interested to know a bit more about what were the kinds of sources you were using. Obviously, we've talked about oral history. What other kinds of materials were you using, and where were they archived? Where were they held? Because I think this is just such a wonderful model and inspiration to us all of how you can visit sources that are there, that are traditional in your words, that are well known, but actually asking them different questions, you can get them to reveal such a different and such a rich story. So could you tell us a little bit more about the range of sources and where you found them? Thank you.
Yes, so a lot of them were actually at the Science Industry Museum in Manchester. So they have the archives there. So I explored many of sort of materials that were held there. A lot of documents and sort of talking about sort of Platt Brothers like intentions and like how much how many machines they were making. All that was archived, but also when I explored Oldham's archives as well. And I spoke with the archivist there, and they were telling me how their archives are very underused by researchers. I think, and they had a surprising like amount of material that was held there in the first place. So I just found it fascinating how it was very underused. I think just like the fact that people don't know that it's there, and um, it's yeah quite yeah because I didn't know much about Oldham architects myself, and I live in Oldham. I guess it's worth exploring. And when I spoke with them about sort of their sort of social media, sort of making their name out there, just it's again to do funding that they haven't got the facilities to sort of share more about their research, and maybe like even like putting out blog pieces or something like that. It could have helped to sort of make themselves more known. But yeah, when I explored all the markets, I had like, so much material. Like, I had to make like several trips there, and there was so much there that when I showed my colleagues at the museum, yeah, they were surprised that that this existed. Like for example, the postcards that I mentioned before, or the Christmas cards that I mentioned before. Yeah, they weren't, and sort of bringing out that story and using the archives for that. It was really good, and yeah, it was just wonderful to platform that in my case study.
That's brilliant to hear. It's also, for me and maybe for others in the room, a great example of that reminder for us all to always talk to our friendly neighbourhood archivists, because often they have these wonderful resources that they know could be used in innovative and original ways to tell new stories, and there's often so much untapped potential there, isn't there? Thank you, Sibia.
Christian has asked, do the people in Oldham have a sense of loss about the building being demolished?
I'm not too sure actually. From what I remember, and this is just from like personal experiences of just growing up, we call it the Elk Mill Shopping Park, but we don't know much about the history of the mill itself, and not many times questions asked about the mill. But when I did sort of put that case out there, I did sort of send it to like schools. I told like local schools and the and all the market, but this is our project, this is our work, and please share and tell people, because I think it's important to get this out there and get people to sort of learn a bit more about their own local histories, and hope as well that it will help people understand, like, it's not just Elk Mill that exists in Oldham, there's loads of mills that exist in Oldham. Sort of building that connection to like research further stories and work on further stories of the current existing mills that they're not demolished, but they're not in use. So just learning about those would be great, because yeah, I think it's important to learn that history.
Did you come across any kind of contested history around that mill? And I mean, particularly, I could imagine like the closing of it. It might not be a sort of a sense of loss of the building itself, but that loss of kind of income or local industry or local employment, or also kind of like the political issues around having a workforce and a kind of employer like that. Did any of that sort of emerge from your research?
Yes, I tried to highlight it in my research, in my case study, but yeah, it was quite contested when the mill had closed. But it was at the same time, it was also unsurprising that it closed, because just growing competition like foreign countries, it was just inevitable in a sense. But I tried to sort of humanize the stories of those who had lost jobs, and that was their sort of source of income. It was, yeah, it's important to highlight the stories, but I think further work could be done in that area to explore like the sort of stories about how like locals felt about the mill itself closing, but also what happened afterwards, like where did they go, like what could they do.
Thank you. I wonder if there's anybody else in the room who has any kind of similar examples of having thought about kind of case studies in their global context, or having thought around kind of local sites that have been lost and what a local community, kind of the kind of general feeling that local community or shared memories, inherited memories that people might have about a space that they might want to share.
While people have a little,
Oh,
sorry,
carry on.
was I speaking over someone? I couldn't tell.
No, that was me.
Well,
It was me.
oh, sorry, Ruth. So yeah, just while people have a little think, I'd made another connection, Sibia, with our colleague Claire Langhammer's work. We must share this recording with her. So she's working on work at the moment, history of work, but she is a trustee of the Mass Observation Project, and recently published a book with Hester Barron called Class of 1937, and it's looking at essays written by school children at an elementary school in Bolton in 1937 about their lives, but also their ambitions, what they wanted to be when they grew up, where they went on holiday, their dreams. And one of the really interesting things there is that, particularly for the girls, but actually for many of them, their destiny, whatever they might have dreamed of at that point, was to go and work in the textiles industry locally. And it strikes me that mass observation material might be another kind of interesting way into thinking about this, from a local level. But again, very much in terms of how industry impacts on social history and lives. But I see that Christiana has a hand up.
Yeah, Christiana, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Oh,
Hi.
sorry. Sorry, I'm a bit wild. I've been out on a walk today. I know nothing about Oldham, but of course it's been in the news a fair bit. So I'm really interested with what you have been telling us and about your project. My area is Whitby, but mostly medieval. But it's I'm thinking of the town now, and also the whole of Teesside, which sort of is nearby. And because when you were talking about the mill being demolished in the 90s, actually what struck me about that is the recent demolishing of the steelworks on Teesside and the outcry that there was. Well, can't go into politics, but people have quite a lot invested in the physical structures. And the same with Whitby. People love coming there because of the history, the old buildings, but what happens when it's demolished? Then what happens to the town? And the feeling for local people, but also the visitors who come. In a way, people want new things and they destroy the old, but then they no longer want to visit because there's nothing there to visit anymore. So there are all sorts of issues with those sort of losses, but also then again, the older people who remember. My husband is local to Whitby, but for him, he no longer feels like his home. And I'm wondering whether some of these issues come up in oral histories, that how when places change, and especially if a lot of jobs disappear, what are people's identity then? And do they still feel a sense of belonging? So I'm not necessarily very good at, since I'm just thinking on the hoof, that I describe what I mean, but I hope something can stimulate that. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Okay. I think with sort of learning about loss of place and sense of belonging, it's quite a tricky one. I'm not too sure to answer. I think when I was reading sort of The Voices of Shiloh by Freda Miller, which sort of captures the voices of those who work there, they did sort of experience loss of self, because their work was their sort of livelihood, and it was more of a, it wasn't just work, it was also that personal relationship as well, like how I mentioned that they were very much supported by those that they worked for. And I think it creates a loss of identity, a loss of friendships, loss of relationships that all exist in it. And I've not been able to sort of explore those stories in my research myself. So I'm not too sure to answer, but I think it's very worthwhile in noting that that does happen and it does exist, and there needs to be some sort of research that comes out of it as well, because yeah, I would love to explore that, because it's a very deep connection, loss of place with loss of identity and losing that sense of belonging.
I mean, I wonder if I could just comment that I think Christiana's question and your answer, Sibia, really point to perhaps the wider and transferable kind of value and importance of the sort of methodologies and insights that you're developing. Obviously, in the 80s and 90s, particularly in the north of England, lots of long established industries came to an end with consequences that are still playing out today, and difficulties around transitions in communities to other forms of employment, and loss of that long-standing kind of identity that you're talking about. It was in the news just now, the sort of threat to Port Talbot Steelworks in South Wales, and these are still ongoing issues, and I think Christiana was pointing to those really well. And it strikes me that the kind of work you're doing could be really vital in helping us understand better, when this is happening now in the present, how to kind of do that archiving really well, collecting those memories, and also supporting communities through this sort of transition, so that maybe we can do better in the future than just sort of demolish things and build a shopping centre. Maybe things can be more nuanced and more
yes.
more careful. So it seems that I don't know if you have a sense of that yourself, but this seems like it could be really vital.
Yeah, definitely, it could be vital. And I know there are like so for example, in Manchester, we have the Ahmed Iqbal or the Race Relations Centre, and they do some like supporting work with community groups, especially like sort of working with both older and younger generations and having that conversation going and then recording those as oral history testimonies, which then is then supporting their archives. So more of that work would be great to do and explore, because I think having that sort of documented, or maybe creating some sort of artwork with those groups in mind, it'd be a great way to sort of explore that history and keep that history well preserved as well.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about these places that are actually in kind of quite regular transition at the moment, in terms of, you know, how do you maintain a sense of place and a sense of community when things are transient? There's some really interesting kind of ideas there. Amanda, I've seen your hand up, but I'm just going to very quickly just highlight what Stephen has put in the chat first. So suggested that a future project could be, would involve a wider group, could be on retail businesses using cotton goods on the high street, including street markets, so clothes shops, haberdasherers and tailors in Oldham and the Greater Manchester area. The cooperative movement with the history of retailing, wholesale and production, and so covering a kind of 150 to 200 year period, thinking about the various different ways in which a material thing was kind of working its way around this place, being made, being sold, being exchanged, being made into other things, being used, being worn. That kind of circulation of objects, I think, is really fascinating. From like the beginning, right, following it all the way through and thinking about all the different kind of global networks involved in that process. Amanda, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. So I'm Amanda Brooks-Good. I'm from the School of Art and Design at Nottingham Trent University. Sorry, my camera's a bit odd, isn't it? Okay, hello. You can see the top of my head, I think. So yes, thank you for that. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I just wanted to share a similar project that we have done here in Nottingham. So we have done an oral history project for people who worked in the fashion and textile industries. We focused on the period between 1980 and 2005. You know, people have just made reference there to the sort of deindustrialisation process. I've been working with the lace. We have a lace archive in the School of Art and Design, which was collated from the mid 1900s till about 1940 as a teaching resource to teach lace design students to support the local lace industry at the time. And I kind of got involved in looking at the lace archive quite accidentally, really, but I did about 20 years ago, and have then done lots of kind of community-based projects, because what became really apparent to me as a non-native person to Nottingham is all the civic pride that there is imbued within that industry that empowered this quite small town in the East Midlands. You know, it is a city now, but essentially it's a small town from the East Midlands. But it's along with, you know, things like Robin Hood, and a couple of famous football teams, you know, it kind of gives a lot of a sense of identity. And I think, you know, people have been making reference to that. The point where I got involved in sort of doing community projects was a point where the museums were going through a very difficult sort of phase in around 2007, 2008, to do with some things that specifically happened in Nottingham, but then also the economic crash that we had in that period affected anybody's ability to commemorate or see lace in the city or regionally. And we do have a lot of people who travel to Nottingham to come and see that lace heritage. So it suddenly went very invisible. And I think there was a phase that many of the kind of places that you know have been referenced here now, in terms of that deindustrialisation process, where actually the local city, in terms of local government, feel a bit embarrassed about what they perceived as failed industries, and have kind of wanted to ignore it and push it under the carpet. And I think there's kind of a transitional period where some time needs to go by before they can start celebrating and thinking about that heritage. And I think we're in that sort of place now. So there is visibility in the museum context in Nottingham where you can see lace. But one of the things we wanted to do, and we broadened it from thinking only about lace workers, was to think about the kind of the wider employment context of fashion and textiles manufacturing in the city and the region. So we got funding from Heritage Lottery Fund, and we did an oral history project. We finished it in just at 2021. And we've got about 55 oral history interviews that are at the East Midlands Oral History Archive, and we've now got somebody doing a PhD and really kind of burrowing down a little bit more on looking at some of the kind of major themes that are coming through. And there's some of the themes that she's particularly interested in are to do with deindustrialisation, they are to do with civic pride. They are also to do, I guess, with a lot of the kind of paternalism of the companies that people worked at in the region. So there were a lot of very large employers, and things that the sort of things that people shared and talked about were things that, sound unusual to us now. So kind of like sporting groups, days to the seaside, Easter bonnet parades, these kinds of activities. And we've got, people have brought along photographs, they've brought along newsletters, physical newsletters that people had in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, that everything's gone digital now. Who is collecting this stuff? I don't know, but I hope somebody is collecting the sort of digital elements. So I just wanted to share that with you, really, and say that I'm just writing an abstract. I've been writing this afternoon about the lace market. So we have an area in Nottingham called the Lace Market, which is Victorian warehouses, where the sort of trading for the lace industry happened, as well as kind of some of the storage and some of the ancillary processes happened. But that area, as it is in many other cities around the UK, is now bars and restaurants and luxury flats. But there is a lot of civic pride left in that area, and at least those buildings are being looked after because of those things. And not knocked down. Some of them on the more of the outskirts of Nottingham, some amazing mills and beautiful mills have been knocked down, but the lace market is a pretty special area, and luckily that still exists. So I don't have any questions for you, I'm afraid. I just wanted to share that sort of those common purposes with you and those interests. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I want to know, so your project, how long will that be going on for, the lace the lace?
It's the project that we did with Heritage Lottery Fund is finished. So
okay,
we did that in 2019, 2020, ended it in the middle of 2021. So that's complete. But the person who was a research fellow on that project is now doing a PhD. With that, so that is continuing. She's doing that part-time, so she's a couple of years into that.
Amazing. So are we able to sort of read into this project? Like, I know you said it's finished now. Is there any published work that we can
still
access?
a website. I'll put the link in the chat. Yeah. It was called Textile Tales.
Perfect. Yeah, I'd love to read it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I mean, there's so much there. And I mean, I've been thinking about, when you started talking about Nottingham, I was thinking about the way in which the landscape of Nottingham still tells a story of lace making if you know how to read it. If you don't know how to read it, then it may well be well forgotten. So yeah, very interesting that you kind of thought about that in contrast to the sort of demolition of the mill in Oldham. Catherine, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just quickly, thanks so much for sharing that, Amanda. It's wonderful the way Sibia's project has kind of more connections, Sibia. It seems like there's wonderful kind of possibilities for comparative work and further discussion there. I was really struck by a phrase that Amanda used multiple times when she was speaking, and it's something that we've not talked about yet, and the phrase was civic pride. And I'd like to spend a little bit more time kind of thinking about that, and maybe ask you, Sibia, a little bit about how you see your work dovetailing with that. I mean, this is such kind of dynamic vocabulary at the moment. I'm thinking of the levelling up agenda, the white paper, the prospectus, which really puts pride at the heart of that agenda. Now, we may well have a different government at the end of this week. I'm not going to say any more than that, but I don't think the place agenda is going away. I don't think these agendas around regional development, regional regeneration, sustainable development are going away. And I think what's really striking in the levelling up prospectus and documents is that it states explicitly that the measure of success isn't going to be quantitative data. It's not going to be statistics and numbers. It's going to be increased pride in place. So it's about emotion. It's about pride. So civic pride is really at the heart of that vision for renewed, regenerated, sustainable, successful places. As I say, a new government may come at this from a different angle, but I think that a lot of this is here to stay in some shape or form. So I was really struck by the language that Amanda was using, and I wondered, Sibia, is this the kind of language that you use in your framing of your project? Is it something that you think consciously about, the way that the work you're doing is helping to nourish civic pride and renew a sense of civic pride? I don't know if Amanda wants to add any comments either, but Sibia, is this something that feels very live in terms of the way you work?
I think when I think about civic pride, it's never on paper, but it's just something I internalize. It's that sort of pride in where I'm from, the place, essentially. And I think a lot of the time, one of the reasons that from a personal perspective is just I think Oldham usually gets quite a bad rep sometimes, and it's just the whole idea, there's a lot of history that we don't know about, and it's just important to feel proud of where you're from. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to also explore Oldham's heritage, because there's a lot I didn't know, and I think there's a lot to be proud of, what our people have done as well, as Oldhamers, and exploring that connection as well globally. We've not just done stuff for our own town, but just exploring how the big things that we've done elsewhere as well. So yeah, I think it's important to have civic pride and enabling sort of those discussions to continue. So, and I think a lot of the time as well, with Oldham and Manchester, they sort of see us, they just see us different, but also that we're very, very much well connected, and the things that we've done for Manchester's cotton industry, we had played an important part as workers as well. So yeah, I think it's an important thing to think about, and and it's the term that I've not really thought about often, but I think I've internalized it as a researcher. Yeah,
it's so sort of fundamental, clearly, to what you're doing, where it's coming from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amanda, do you have anything?
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say, I do think it's really important that, all places like Oldham are recognised, or places like Nottingham or Leicester, Sheffield or Stoke-on-Trent, who have all been involved in manufacturing, but, do get stepped over for the bigger metropolises, and recognition of those. So I think that decentering of the geography of production is probably something that we should talk about more.
Yeah, great, thank you. Is there anybody else who has a kind of burning question or something that they would like to contribute before we wrap up this evening? Okay, in which case I think it's time to say thank you very much to Sibia for sparking such fascinating conversations. I feel like we've travelled quite a long way over the last hour, both kind of geographically, but starting from one point of a conversation, thinking about a very specific project that has opened up a lot of doors to think more broadly about some of the themes. So thank you so much, Sibia. It's been really wonderful. And thank you to everybody who's come and everybody who's contributed to the conversation this evening.